Chapter 1. Gold among silver. The Aerie of Final Measure. The world is old, and it remembers not in tales but in weight and pressure laid upon itself through ages uncounted. Stone keeps no record of the hands that shaped it, nor do the seas mourn the shores they have taken. Before mortals named virtue or gods learned the commerce of worship, there were laws older than speech. Balance was not a hope or a moral striving. It was the manner by which the world endured. When that balance bent too far, something answered. Not in wrath, nor in mercy, but as frost answers heat and night follows day. Among the eldest of these answers are the metallic greatwyrms, called dragons only for want of a truer name, and perhaps because mortals tend to stop inventing new nouns once something can incinerate them from several directions at once. They are not merely ancient creatures grown vast with time, but convergences of many lives drawn together across the scattered worlds of the material plane. Many selves, shaped by different choices and fates, are gathered into a single will, rather like a committee that has finally agreed on one agenda and then discovered it can breathe fire. Such a being comes to pass only where memory, purpose, and restraint are in accord, and most selves will not so readily surrender their singularity. Bahamut is said to watch these crossings, not as a giver of reward, but as a keeper of what has already come into being, binding what might otherwise tear itself apart. Thus some greatwyrms are named as gods, bearing not only great power, but the heavy and mildly inconvenient knowledge of what that power has wrought elsewhere when it was not held in check. To stand before a greatwyrm is to feel possibility narrowed into certainty. The world leans toward them as water toward gravity, or as arguments toward silence, when a very large presence clears its throat. Their breath does not merely burn, it reorders. Armies fail not always by slaughter, but by the quiet draining of their strength and will, the sudden realization that every plan they had was optimistic to the point of comedy. Lands are not always laid waste. Some are simply removed from the pattern, their influence undone, as though the world itself has crossed them out and written no longer relevant in the margin. Of all these beings, Lendys is the most feared. He is judgment without comfort, silver and cold as the high winter stars, and about as sympathetic. Where Tamara listens and restores, Lendys measures and corrects. He asks no reasons and grants no absolution. He weighs consequence against the turning of the world and acts when the balance no longer holds. Chromatic dragons expect his coming and rail against it. Metallic dragons dread it, for his gaze falls upon stewards rather than monsters. To be judged by Lendys is to be found unfit for trust, and his passing leaves no ruin born of fury, only the quiet certainty that what would not bend has been made, at last to break, preferably cleanly. To his followers, Lendys is not a source of comfort. He is an absolute principle given form, which makes him a poor conversationalist but an excellent final authority. Justice without mercy is not cruelty in their theology. Mercy is seen as a variable, something that destabilizes systems meant to endure. Forgiveness may feel humane, but it allows imbalance to persist, and persistence, in their view, is how catastrophes get ideas above their station. What matters is outcome. Harm exists. Balance is broken. Correction is required. This is the entirety of the equation, and its simplicity is both its strength and its sorrow, as well as the reason it fits so neatly on stone tablets. Within the High Temple, this belief has hardened into something colder than most mortal laws. Purity is not measured by intention or alignment, but by restraint practiced over time. Power that could have been used and was not is the highest virtue, though it is rarely applauded and almost never thanked. A benevolent act carries little weight if it was easy. A ruler is only just if they could have ruled cruelly and chose not to. Virtue without capacity is meaningless, for only where temptation exists can moral worth be tested, preferably repeatedly and under uncomfortable circumstances. From this emerges a judgment that is almost mathematical in its severity. Actions are weighed not against ideals, but against the full scope of what the actor was capable of doing. A century of restraint cannot erase a single failure if the consequences are great enough. Patterns matter more than moments, but moments of sufficient weight can redefine a life entirely, usually at the worst possible time. This is why Lendys' justice is so often experienced as monstrous by those who endure it. It refuses to contextualize. It refuses to tell stories of redemption. It will not allow meaning to soften harm, no matter how eloquently meaning pleads its case. At the heart of this doctrine lies a paradox the cult does not attempt to resolve, largely because resolving it would require feelings. Justice applied without compromise may preserve the world while violating the moral instincts of those who live within it. Innocents may suffer fear and loss as judgments are rendered far beyond their understanding. Communities may be broken to prevent greater collapse. The High Temple does not claim this is good, it claims it is necessary. Moral revulsion, in their teaching, is not evidence of injustice, but a sign that justice has passed beyond comfort and into territory where no one has thought to put up benches. And so Lendys is not the God to whom people pray when they wish the world to be kind. He is the God invoked when the world must be made stable, whatever the cost. His followers do not ask whether an act is compassionate. They ask whether the balance can survive without it. In asking that question often enough, they have built a system that endures but does not know how to heal, and that may one day discover that survival without mercy carries its own quiet kind of ruin, and is also, inconveniently, very hard to live with. The spine of the world has always inspired fear, but fear is too ordinary a word for what the unclimbable heights demand. Fear suggests something that might be overcome with courage, or at least negotiated with poor judgment and a rope. These peaks are not simply tall. They feel arranged against the very idea of ascent, as if the world, having once permitted too much ambition, reviewed the results and issued a permanent correction in stone. From below, the upper ridgelines do not look like summits meant to be reached. They look like walls, sheer and pale, rising into cloud and storm with a blunt finality that suggests refusal rather than challenge. The mountains do not beckon. They do not promise views. They do not invite legend. They stand as a boundary between what is lived and what is judged, and they seem faintly annoyed that anyone might confuse the two. Their faces are slick with ice and wind-polished rock, not rough enough for purchase, not broken enough for paths. Centuries of screaming weather have scoured them smooth, grinding stone into a hard gleam that catches the light like glass or like something that has been sharpened deliberately. There are no goat trails, no switchbacks, no places where the earth seems to have accidentally forgiven a climber's need. The rare ledges that appear from a distance vanish upon approach, revealed as illusions of perspective, angles that only pretended to offer mercy before withdrawing it without apology. The people of the north tell stories that the heights were once climbable. They do not agree on why they ceased to be, which is usually how one can tell a story has been told for a very long time. Some speak of an ancient transgression, a mortal king who tried to carry his law into the sky, or a tribe of giants who attempted to chain a storm and were punished for it, presumably after a brief and educational demonstration. Others say the mountains change slowly, as if learning, the way a living thing learns when it has been poked too often in precisely the wrong places. Once they had been touched too many times by those who sought power rather than understanding, they tightened themselves. They sharpened their winds, deepened their cold, and drew the storms closer until ascent became not merely difficult but impossible. Whether this is myth or memory matters very little to those who live beneath the peaks. The result is the same. The heights reject shortcuts as if they recognize them on sight and take personal offense. A permanent storm system coils around the upper reaches. It does not wander with season. It does not clear with patience. It sits there like an expression held too long, thick clouds grinding against stone, lightning striking not with randomness, but with a kind of unnerving precision, as though it has a list. The winds have the clean violence of things that do not negotiate. They slice through armor. They lift bodies and fling them without effort, not angrily, but efficiently. The cold is not simply cold, but an absence that steals intention, turning bravery into numbness and numbness into sleep. Even breathing becomes an act of defiance. The air thins until breath is labor, then pain, then a frantic animal impulse that provides no relief and resents being asked. Magic, too, falters there, and this is what makes the heights feel not merely dangerous, but judging. Spells that should lift a body, soften a fall, or pierce a blizzard sputter and break as if the mountain refuses to be cheated and has seen all the usual tricks before. Teleportation collapses into useless sparks. Levitation shudders and fails. Attempts to reshape stone meet resistance as if the rock were alive and did not consent to alteration, which, in a sense, it does not. There is no single ward that can be identified, no runic barrier one can point to and name. The magic is older than the impulse to announce itself. It is simply present, woven into wind and granite and pressure. Those who try to overcome it often describe the same sensation, not pain, not terror, but the unsettling awareness of being measured and found unconvincing. This is why the unclimbable heights belong so neatly to the doctrine of Lendys. If justice is to be more than a convenience, it cannot be accessed by cleverness alone. It cannot be stumbled into. It must demand a cost commensurate with consequence. The heights enforce that truth without speaking it. They do not forbid approach. They require ascension. There is a difference. A door can be locked. A mountain can only be refused, and here refusal is the lesson. Those who reach the summit do so not by trick or force, but by meeting the mountain on its terms, which are steep, cold, and unhelpfully literal. Flight, therefore, is not merely a privilege at the Aerie. It is a requirement. Wings are the only honest answer to the demand for elevation. To fly to the heights is to accept exposure. There is no hiding from wind, no shelter from the sky. One rises in full view of storm and cold, and every movement upward is deliberate. The mountain does not test strength alone. It tests endurance, restraint, and the willingness to continue upward when every instinct urges retreat, and several good arguments support that instinct. Those who arrive do not arrive accidentally. They arrive having chosen judgment, and in that choice lies the first surrender, the surrender of convenience, followed shortly by the surrender of warmth. The Aerie of Final Measure does not crown the mountain like a palace or a fortress. It is carved into the peak, inseparable from the stone, as though the mountain had been opened to reveal a form that was already there and faintly impatient to be found. From a distance, it appears as terraces and plains cut with such precision that they feel less constructed than uncovered. The architecture has no flourish. There are no banners snapping in the wind, no spires reaching to impress the gods, no domes to soften the severity of the lines. The temple announces itself not through spectacle but through certainty. Its proportions are balanced the way a scale is balanced, not because balance is beautiful, but because imbalance would be incorrect. Symmetry governs everything. Corridors align with corridors. Stairways mirror stairways. Columns stand in pairs, measured so precisely that even a casual glance senses intent and suspects it would be unwise to step out of line. The stone is left bare, polished only enough to remove weakness, not enough to become decorative. It gleams faintly in places where ice has etched it smooth, and elsewhere it holds the roughness of its origin, an honest reminder that judgment is not made of comfort. There are no heroic murals, no carved saints, no scenes of triumph to reassure the visitor that this place has purpose beyond itself. History here is not celebrated. It is recorded efficiently and without commentary. The heart of the temple lies the hall of weighing, and it is larger than one expects, not because it wishes to impress, but because it must contain what is brought into it. The ceiling vanishes into shadow. The floor is etched with concentric rings of draconic inscriptions, each ring a boundary of meaning, each boundary a reminder that nothing in this hall is casual. Here, deeds are spoken and set down. Evidence is presented without flourish. Testimony is recorded without argument. There is no performance of persuasion, no dramatic pleading. Silence is permitted, but only once, and only because silence itself can be testimony. The hall does not echo with debate. It absorbs it. When voices end, what remains is conclusion, which has a way of feeling heavier than anything said aloud. Deeper still rest the scales of binding, an artifact older than any surviving scripture. They are massive, wrought of silver-veined stone and cold metal, suspended by chains that vanish into the darkness above, as though the temple itself refuses to reveal how they are held, possibly out of professional discretion. The scales are not symbolic. When invoked, they respond. In their presence, magic grows thin and unreliable, as if truth is too heavy to share space with illusion. Lies do not shatter theatrically. They simply collapse, embarrassed. Those bound by the scales are not punished through pain, but through clarity so absolute it becomes unbearable. The mind is forced to see what it has done without the shelter of justification, excuse, or creative reinterpretation. Not everyone can endure that sight. Some beg for execution simply to escape the honesty, which is duly noted. Beyond even this chamber lies the vault of names. It is not a hall of honor. It's a ledger of judgment fulfilled. Along its walls, names are cut into stone in draconic script, each accompanied by sparse notation, lineage, transgression, sentence. There are no epithets of praise, no accounts of virtue, no space allotted for the softening details that mortals call context. A life is reduced to the moment balance was broken, efficiently and without sentiment. Visitors often leave shaken, for many names belong to dragons remembered elsewhere as benefactors, guardians, wise counselors, even saints of mercy. Here they are simply entries, proof that kindness does not erase consequence, and that virtue can fail under the weight of its own certainty, particularly when certainty becomes comfortable. And what is most striking about the Aerie is not what it contains, but what it refuses to offer. There are no rooms meant for comfort, no confessionals where absolution is granted, no shrines where forgiveness is requested, no altars inviting prayer in hopes of intervention. Petitioners do not come here to be spared, they come to be measured. The temple does not promise salvation, it promises accuracy. In this place, mercy is not absent because no one has ever thought to include it. It is absent because its absence is the point. The Aerie is an engine built to weigh, to record, and to correct, and, in its cold symmetry, one can feel the doctrine made stone. Justice must be difficult, elevated, and inaccessible to convenience, or it becomes merely another human tool bent by desire and called virtue, which is exactly the sort of thing the mountain refuses to tolerate. Clinging to the stone of the Aerie and the surrounding cliffs is a community that most of Faerûn has never seen, and would struggle to understand even if given diagrams. The dragonborn of the Aerie are numerous, the largest such population known, yet they do not spread, trade, or migrate. They remain where judgment resides, shaped by altitude, doctrine, and centuries of living in close proximity to consequence, which has a way of discouraging tourism. They are physically distinct from other dragonborn, their forms altered by generations of flight and thin air. Their bones are denser, their muscles compact and efficient. Their lungs are layered, capable of drawing breath where most creatures would choke, complain briefly, and then fall off something. Their wings are not vestigial symbols of heritage but powerful instruments, broad and scarred, built for endurance rather than grace, and entirely uninterested in looking impressive while doing it. From their earliest years, children are taught not joy but function. Flight training begins as soon as bone and muscle allow, not as celebration, but as necessity. To fall is not framed as failure, but as imbalance. To recover is not praised as courage, but expected as correction. Applause in this context would suggest surprise, which would be deeply unsettling. Stories told to the young are not of heroes who followed their hearts, but of calamities averted through restraint, exercised too late or just in time. The lesson is always the same. Catastrophe does not arrive suddenly. It accumulates patiently, while people reassure themselves that good intentions will suffice, right up until they very clearly do not. Their society is arranged into rigid castes, each defined by service rather than aspiration. Judges study doctrine and precedent, their lives spent interpreting measure rather than issuing opinion, which is regarded as a regrettable indulgence elsewhere. Record keepers maintain the archives, committing deeds and sentences to stone and memory with equal care. knowing that omission is a form of corruption and that footnotes are not optional. Enforcers train for defense and execution, not glorified warriors but instruments prepared to act without hesitation, ceremony, or visible enthusiasm. Ascetics withdraw from influence entirely, living lives of deliberate limitation as reminders of restraint taken to its furthest extreme, and as a quiet warning against the sort of ambition that begins sentences with "just this once." Movement between these castes is rare and slow. Advancement is not granted for brilliance or ambition, but for consistency demonstrated over decades. Those who seek authority are quietly redirected, sometimes reassigned, sometimes removed. To desire power openly is considered a warning sign, not a qualification. Among the dragonborn of the Aerie, leadership is understood as burden. To rule is to bear weight, not to command obedience, and the weight is very carefully itemized. Emotion is not absent among them, but it is carefully governed. Affection exists, though it is muted. Grief is acknowledged, then contained. Anger is treated as a diagnostic condition rather than a moral failing, much like a fever or a structural crack. Outsiders whisper that children are raised without love, that elders would condemn their own kin without hesitation. These rumors are not entirely false, but they misunderstand what has been traded. The Aerie has chosen endurance over warmth, stability over intimacy. What it has lost in comfort, it has gained in cohesion, which is not the same thing, but is harder to argue with once established. This endurance has been tested many times, most visibly through the practice that defines the temple's purpose, judgment rendered upon dragons themselves. Contrary to mortal imagination, these judgments do not unfold as dramatic trials or divine confrontations. There are no summons issued to the accused, no chance to plead before evidence verdict is gathered quietly, patterns observed over years or centuries, which is generally long enough for most excuses to expire. Repeated interference in mortal governance draws scrutiny first, especially when a dragon's influence begins to shape laws, dynasties, or wars according to personal preference rather than necessity. The founding of cults, whether overt or subtle, follows closely. The accumulation of hordes beyond what a region can bear is likewise watched, not as greed alone, but as distortion, wealth exerting gravity long after its owner withdraws. When judgment is pronounced, it is rendered at the Aerie, often without the presence of the dragon being judged. This absence is intentional. The temple does not function as a forum for persuasion. Verdict is reached through measure, not debate. The dragon learns of the sentence only when it is carried out, which is considered efficient, if not particularly polite. Execution belongs to one being alone. Argentus Iudex does not arrive with retinues or allies. He does not bargain, threaten, or sermonize. He announces the charges, states the sentence. The speed and precision of this process are central to its meaning. Judgment is not shared. It is not delegated. It is not softened by consensus. The act belongs to the one who bears its weight, and bearing it is clearly not a hobby. In the aftermath, the dragonborn descend upon what remains with the same restraint that governed the execution itself. Hordes are catalogued, wealth not claimed that might destabilize kingdoms is broken apart or redistributed in ways designed to minimize further imbalance. Artifacts capable of warping power structures are sealed away or unmade entirely. Nothing is preserved simply because it is magnificent. Grandeur is not a defense, nor is it considered an extenuating circumstance. To the outside world, these disappearances register as rumor, coincidence, or legend. Mortal courts do not acknowledge the Aerie, preferring silence to understanding. Scholars reshape fragments into stories that feel safer than truth and considerably easier to rhyme. Denial becomes policy. It is easier to pretend that dragons vanish on their own than to admit that judgment watches even the ancient and the wise, and keeps very good records. Relations with other powers reflect this unease. The cult of the dragon is treated not as an adversary, but as an existential violation. Draconic projects are not debated. They are dismantled, relentlessly and quietly, until nothing remains that could be resurrected. including the enthusiasm that inspired them. Other draconic gods are regarded with wary distance. Bahamut stands closest and yet most uncomfortably so. His emphasis on mercy and redemption aligns with Lendys in intent, but diverges in method. Neither god seeks open conflict, neither fully trusts the other. Their coexistence is maintained through restraint rather than agreement, which is very much on brand. Within the Aerie itself, this distance has begun to take on a different quality. Among the Dragonborn, doubts surface in the spaces between doctrine and record. Some question the execution of metallic dragons remembered elsewhere as benevolent guardians. Others worry that the hand of Lendys has begun to mistake severity for virtue, enforcing measures so rigidly that it risks becoming self-justifying. These concerns are rarely voiced aloud. They linger, instead, in repeated readings of old cases, in silences held too long, in the quiet discomfort of those who have begun to sense that a system designed to prevent catastrophe may itself be losing the ability to distinguish necessity from habit. The elders fear not rebellion. That would be visible, correctable, and properly categorized. What they fear is erosion. Justice that cannot be questioned even internally risks transforming from correction into sanctified violence. The Aerie was built to preserve balance, not to worship its own certainty. Whether those who serve it can remember that distinction, as centuries press and doctrine hardens, remains an unanswered question, hanging in the thin air like a storm that has not yet decided to break, but is clearly considering it. Argentus Iudex is not remembered as a ruler, nor as a hero, nor even as a dragon, in the way other ancient worms are recalled. In the records of the Aerie, he appears without ornament or reverence. He is written as a function fulfilled, judgment given body. In the formal tongue of the High Temple, he is called only the Hand, a name chosen to deny intimacy. A hand does not deliberate. It completes what has already been decided, and then withdraws without comment, much as one might extinguish a candle that has finished being useful. There is an early account, kept on stone darkened by age, of a silver dragon who dwelled beside a river that flooded every spring. For 3 generations, he advised the rulers of that valley. He taught them how to channel water, how to restrain ambition, how to resolve disputes before they hardened into war. When Argentus Iudex descended, the dragon greeted him calmly and spoke of the good that had been done. The Hand listened. The charge was stated. Followed. By the next morning, the river still flooded, the embankments still held, and the valley endured without its guardian. The kings learned to decide without counsel that carried the weight of eternity. The balance held. The cost was borne slowly by many, and recorded without flourish. Another record tells of a chromatic worm whose dominion was built openly on terror. Villages burned, tribute flowed. When the Hand came, there was no confusion and no plea. The execution was swift. In the margins of the archive, the contrast between these two judgments is noted without comment. One was an enemy. One was a trustee. The latter was judged more severely, which is the sort of detail that causes readers to sit very still. Argentus Iudex did not argue. He did not persuade. He did not justify himself beyond the statement of charge. Those who witnessed his descent spoke less of fear than of stillness, as if the world itself were pausing to accept correction. Judgment was announced, sentence declared, and balance restored through absence. Over centuries, these absences accumulated into understanding. The Hand became precedent. Dragons altered their behavior without naming him. The Dragonborn did not sing of him. He was not prayed to. He was endured, like gravity, felt most strongly in what did not happen, and occasionally blamed for it anyway. Then, without omen or explanation, the Hand ceased to descend. The first record of this absence is brief, an imbalance noted, measures taken, judgment anticipated. No descent recorded. The scribe adds a single uncertain line, no correction observed. It is the first time doubt enters the archive, and it does so very quietly, as though hoping not to be noticed. Deep beneath the Aerie lies the chamber of stillness, carved to the measure of a dragon who was never meant to rise easily again. Argentus Iudex lies there, coiled within wards cut into the living mountain. The sigils, they do not comfort. This is not the slow sleep of age, or the cyclical rest of a great beast. Stillness, maintained by vigilance and will. That it was achieved at all speaks less to strength than to intent, and to a willingness to do what doctrine had never anticipated. Valerian Calum stood in that chamber when the final sigil was set. The stone shuddered once and fell quiet. He felt no triumph, only a tightening resolve, and beneath it, something sharper that he did not yet name, like the edge of a thought that insists on being held. Valerian Calum, son of Argentus Iudex, and a mortal woman whose name survives only as a marginal note, rules the Aerie as regent. His scales hold the pale gleam of silver frost. His breath carries winter's edge, yet his body bears the limits of mortality, and his years pass quickly enough that he feels their pressure. He was shaped by an age that did not pause for certainty. Kingdoms rose and fell within decades. Faiths fractured and reformed. Power multiplied faster than wisdom could restrain it. Where his father had acted in a world that still believed in final answers, Valerian inherited one where every correction seemed to spawn 3 new instabilities, each convinced it was an improvement. There is a name in the vault of names that Valerian returned to often, more often than doctrine advised. A gold dragon, remembered elsewhere as a guardian of cities whose execution left a vacuum that drew war and famine inward like wind into a broken hall. Balance had been restored, yet the harm radiated outward for generations. Valerian closed the stone ledger and told himself he was seeing clearly. He did not notice how often his thoughts returned to the same conclusion, that certainty itself was the enemy, and that something cleverer might be required. Publicly, Valerian called his decision a safeguard, a pause, a necessary restraint placed upon an instrument too absolute for a fractured world. Privately, his reasoning shifted. The hand was not merely dangerous, he began to think. It was obsolete. The world no longer needed inevitability. It needed management. It needed perhaps the courage to break inherited systems and see what survived the fall. It was during this slow hardening of conviction that Valerian encountered other ideas, carried upward through intermediaries who spoke carefully and never wrote anything down. They spoke of freedom, of will unbound by ancient measures, of the hidden violence of order itself. They praised doubt as a virtue. They laughed softly at the idea that truth could ever be singular. They did not name their God. Of masks, of secrets as power, of the necessity of unmaking false structures, even if the rubble buried something dear. Valerian listened. He told himself he was studying dissent in order to contain it. He did not notice when containment became fascination, nor when fascination began to feel like relief. Under Valerian's regency, judgment did not vanish. It dispersed and multiplied. There were no longer singular dissents that ended a life and closed a chapter. Instead, there were watchers, observers stationed at the margins of draconic influence, recording not only deeds but tendencies, not only harm but potential. A bronze dragon withdrew from a coastal city after realizing its counsel was being weighed as manipulation. A silver worm abandoned a mountain court when unseen measures accumulated against it. Mortal rulers found their ancient patrons quietly erased from influence, sometimes from memory, through methods that left no single moment to condemn and no clear hand to blame. Judgment no longer fell as a blade. It settled like a net, fine and pervasive, tightening without announcement. To Valerian, this was restraint, precision, a humane alternative to catastrophic certainty. Yet to some among the dragonborn, it felt like another absolutism, quieter but more intimate, one that punished possibility filled with projections rather than names. Balance was preserved, catastrophe delayed. And somewhere in the margins, annotations began to appear that were never officially approved, remarks on contingency, on leverage, on how easily fear could be Guided once released. Valerian's language changed. Where once he spoke of measure and necessity, he began to speak of control, of choice wrested from dead systems, of the moral courage required to decide when rules no longer applied. He told himself that only by mastering judgment could he prevent tyranny. He did not see how mastery itself was becoming the aim, nor how often he smiled at the thought of pulling a thread and watching what unraveled. Deep below, the hand slept on, bound and silent. Above him, a regent who had once feared certainty began to reshape justice around his own will, convinced that he alone could see clearly. And in the thin air of the Aerie where doctrine had once guarded against excess, a quieter danger took root, the belief that dismantling inevitability justified any means, and that balance, once freed from restraint, could be remade according to desire and still be called justice. It was in this age of tightening scrutiny that prophecy returned. Fragments attributed to Alondo the seer had long circulated through monasteries and scriptoria, dismissed as curiosities or poetic excess, the sort of thing scribes enjoyed arguing about when nothing was actively collapsing. Under Valerian's rule, they were gathered, compared, and arranged into a pattern that none could fully explain. The verses spoke obliquely, as Alondo always had, of a turning of measure and the coming of an age weighed at last. Of a child born beneath mingled signs, bearing the calm countenance of one people and the freedom of the upper air upon their shoulders. Of gold, not as crown or coin, but as dawn, which is a far less convenient metaphor. The words did not name a savior or predict a triumph. They described conditions, not outcomes. Change would not arrive as a command, but as recognition. When such a one should walk the world openly, the fragment suggested, the long reckoning would begin, not because fate demanded it, but because the pattern would finally be visible to those who had been watching for balance rather than meaning. Within the Aerie, prophecy was not greeted with reverence Bellatrix or fear. Vesper learned early that difference could be survived if it was never named. In the Aerie, where silver scales caught the pale light of ice and stone, until everything seemed washed in the same restrained hue, her gold was treated as an accident of birth rather than a fact requiring explanation. No one spoke of it. No one asked questions. The silence was a kind of accommodation, and like many accommodations, it came with a cost. She was already marked before she understood why. An orphan with a lineage recorded only in fragments and marginal notes, she bore not only functional wings in a place where many carried them as symbol or scar, but a face that unsettled even those trained not to remark upon such things. Where other dragonborn bore the proud elongation of the draconic snout, Bellatrix's features lay closer to the mortal line, flatter planes, softer angles, eyes set in a way that suggested expression too easily read. It was not monstrous, it was worse, it was familiar. In a culture that prized distance and abstraction, a face that mirrored humanity was another form of excess, another thing best left unremarked. She had been born into cold, and cold shaped her understanding of the world. The heights taught discipline before they taught language. The wind instructed her lungs. The stone taught her balance, yet from the beginning there had been something in her that did not belong to ice. When other children learned to regulate their breath, so that it emerged as frost or cutting chill, Bellatrix learned something else entirely, how to swallow the heat before it reached her throat, how to hold fire behind her teeth until it dulled into warmth, and then into nothing at all. Heat was dangerous in the Aerie, not because it could not be endured, but because it disrupted equilibrium. Ice cracked when warmed too quickly. Snow collapsed. Stone wept. The temple was calibrated for cold and stillness, for endurance rather than comfort. Bellatrix learned to wrap herself in extra layers, not because she needed them, but because others did. She learned to keep her hands clasped, her posture closed, her presence subdued. Brightness, she discovered, was not forbidden. It was simply unwelcome. Her service began young, as all service did. She was assigned to ward maintenance, a task considered suitable for an acolyte of steady temperament and minimal ambition. The wards that bound Argentus Iudex into his enforced slumber were ancient and exacting. their upkeep requiring patience rather than brilliance. Bellatrix followed the same path through the inner chambers, tracing sigils carved into living stone, reinforcing lines of containment with quiet precision. She did not know why the hand slept. She was not taught to ask. The wards existed. They must be maintained. That was sufficient. There was comfort in this repetition. The mountain did not demand interpretation. The sigils did not judge her for what she felt or what she resembled. They responded only to accuracy. Bellatrix found that when she focused on the work, on the careful balancing of energies that were not hers to command, the ache inside her chest quieted. It was easier to restrain fire when one was surrounded by ice. Valerian Calum was present in her life as the mountain was present, massive, distant, and unquestioned. He did not raise her in the way mortal fathers raised children. He did not teach her stories or speak of affection. He assigned, he observed. He corrected when necessary and otherwise allowed her to exist within the structure he governed. Bellatrix understood, dimly, that he was her father in the way the Aerie understood kinship, through function. She did not resent him for this. Resentment required expectations she had never been allowed to form. Yet, distance does not prevent longing. It only gives it space. Among the dragonborn of the Aerie, Bellatrix was treated with what might be called kindness, if one were inclined to generosity and exacting. They praised consistency. They corrected deviation. They never spoke of her fire, or her wings, or the shape of her face, except obliquely, as things that greeted her with courtesy and left her with ease. No one mocked her. No one sought her company either. In a culture that prized restraint above all things, Bellatrix's careful containment of herself was interpreted as virtue, not loneliness. And yet she felt it, the slow ache of having to dim herself to remain in harmony. It was not only the fire in her breath, though that was the most literal expression of it. Her thoughts leapt ahead of doctrine, imagining outcomes not accounted for in the ledgers. It was the way music lingered in her mind longer than it should have, the way she found herself watching the sky beyond the terraces, wondering not what judgment awaited below, but what lives were being lived without it. It was the knowledge that her very presence required explanation she was never allowed to hear. She did not want to overthrow the Aerie. She did not question its necessity. She believed, as she had been taught, that systems existed for reasons deeper than comfort. What troubled her was quieter and more insidious. She wondered whether a life spent entirely in correction, whether balance preserved too carefully might begin to resemble stasis. Whether restraint, practiced without end, could become another form of excess. These were not thoughts she shared. The Aerie was not hostile to questioning, but it was wary of questions that did not resolve into answers. Bellatrix learned to hold her curiosity the way she held her breath weapon, tightly, deliberately, until it burned low enough to be safe. The pain of this restraint was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It settled instead, a constant pressure behind the sternum, a reminder that she was more than what she was permitted to be, and perhaps more than the Aerie knew how to measure. Sometimes when she worked alone in the deeper chambers, she allowed herself small rebellions. She would let her breath warm the stone just enough to feel the difference beneath her palm. She would imagine the wards glowing not with cold light but with gold. She would study her reflection in polished stone and wonder, briefly, which parts of her were accidents and which were deliberate. These moments passed quickly, extinguished by habit and caution, but they sustained her in ways doctrine never quite could. They were proof that what she suppressed was real. The desire to leave did not arrive as a decision. It emerged the way dawn emerges at the edge of night, gradual and undeniable. Bellatrix did not imagine herself fleeing the Aerie or rejecting its purpose. She imagined walking beyond it, carrying what she had learned into places where it had not yet been applied. She wanted to see how balance was negotiated among those who did not carve it into stone. She wanted to know whether restraint could coexist with warmth, whether judgment could be tempered without dissolving. This longing was not heroic. It did not clothe itself in destiny. It was simply human, or as close to human as she allowed herself to think. A curiosity sharpened by isolation, an ache born of having to make oneself smaller, cooler, dimmer, not because one was wrong, but because one was inconvenient. Bellatrix understood that the Aerie had saved the world more than once. She understood that unchecked power, even benevolent power, could warp everything around it. What she did not understand was whether the cost of constant vigilance had to be paid by those who had not yet failed. Whether brightness must always be restrained in anticipation of catastrophe, or whether there were places where it could be allowed to burn without harm. These questions followed her through the corridors and out onto the terraces, where the wind scoured thought into clarity. She watched the clouds drift far below, and felt the distance between herself and the world widen into something almost physical. The Aerie had taught her how to endure. It had taught her how to serve. It had not taught her how to live with the fullness of what she was. In the quiet of her daily labor, Bellatrix Vesper did not yet know that change was approaching her from beyond the mountains. She only knew that the fire she carried could not be extinguished forever without costing her something essential. And though she had been raised to believe that cost was the price of balance, her heart, stubborn and bright, had begun to ask whether balance that demanded the dimming of all light was truly balance at all. They arrived without ceremony, as all things not meant for judgment tend to do, and as several things very much meant for judgment have discovered too late. One morning the wind carried sound that did not belong to the mountain. Not the scream of storm or the low groan of stone under pressure, but laughter, uneven and human, rising and falling without discipline or apology. The dragonborn on the outer terraces paused in their work, not alarmed so much as unsettled. Sound in the Aerie was usually measured, purposeful. Voices low, silence deliberate. This sound wandered. It did not know where it was supposed to go, and showed no interest in finding out. The bardic troop came by winged escort, granted temporary leave to shelter within the lower terraces during a storm cycle too violent even for practiced flyers. 6 of them in all. Men and women of different heights and builds, their skins and scales a scatter of colors that looked almost garish against the Aerie's disciplined stone, as though someone had spilled a painter's palette across a ledger. A dwarf with copper rings in her beard, a slender elf whose laughter seemed to arrive a human woman with scars across her knuckles and a voice that carried warmth like a cup pressed into cold hands. They moved together with an ease that did not erase difference but made room for it. Their harmony was lived, not enforced, and would have been very difficult to file. They carried instruments wrapped in oilcloth and stories made resonant by their clothes were patched and mismatched, repaired with affection rather than uniformity. They thanked their escorts with genuine warmth, not deference, and when shown where they might rest, they settled as if stone and ice were merely another inn, not a sanctum of judgment that usually required people to lower their voices and expectations. Their presence was not defiant. It was simply uncontained, which in the Aerie
Bellatrix
was far
watched
more
from the
troubling.
edge of the
terrace, her hands folded, her wings tucked close. She felt the disturbance ripple through her chest before she understood it. Heat rose unbidden, not dangerous, but alive, like a thought she had trained herself not to finish. The troops' voices echoed strangely against the stone, softened and flattened by walls never meant to carry song. Even so, the sound lingered. It slipped into corridors and corners where silence usually reigned supreme, and it did not apologize for itself, which Bellatrix found both alarming and oddly reassuring. The dragonborn assigned to observe them did so with questions, of course, asked carefully and answered easily. Where had they come from? Had they heard of the Aerie before? The bards answered with stories rather than facts, and the observers recorded what could be recorded and let the rest pass. Doctrine did not forbid joy. It simply did not know what to do with it, much like a very well-trained guard. Bellatrix presented something loosen in her as she watched them interact. They interrupted one another. They laughed at their own mistakes. They argued briefly over where to sit and resolved it, without reference to hierarchy, precedent, or an etched stone diagram. Balance among them was not a calculation. It was a negotiation renewed moment by moment. She realized with a small shock that she had never seen such a thing up close, and that it worked far better than doctrine suggested it should. She saw him. He stood slightly apart from the others, not withdrawn but attentive, as if listening for a cue that had not yet arrived. His skin was red, not the muted crimson of dried blood or rusted iron, but a living color, vivid and unapologetic, as though it had declined to participate in the Aries palette entirely. His horns curved back in a gentle sweep, polished smooth by habit rather than ornament. His tail flicked absently behind him, a quiet punctuation to his movements. His eyes caught the light and held it, kindled with something that Bellatrix recognized instantly and had never before been allowed to name. Warmth. Not the disciplined warmth of Hearthstone carefully regulated, but the warmth of presence, of being fully where one was. It struck her with a force that was not violent but absolute, like stepping from shadow into sun and realizing the shadow had been voluntary all along. For a moment, the mountain receded. The stone beneath her feet became incidental. All the careful measures she had learned fell silent beneath the sudden clarity of recognition. He looked at her. There was no flourish to it, no dramatic pause. Their eyes met, and in that meeting something aligned that had been out of alignment for longer than she could remember. It was not desire at first, not in the way stories described it. It was recognition. As if something in her that had been folded inward for safety had been seen and named without words and found acceptable without review. Bellatrix did not move, neither did he. The space between them held, charged but gentle. She felt the heat in her chest flare, not painfully this time, but cleanly, like without a flame thinking, finally without doctrine or permission. She prayed. She did not know the words, prayer, had never been taught them. She did not consider whether soon listen to places like the Aerie, where love was considered a destabilizing force, and filed accordingly. The prayer rose anyway, unmediated and unashamed, a simple offering of feeling rather than request. Let this be allowed. Let this be real. The answer did not arrive as thunder or vision. It arrived as certainty, which was far more disruptive. Bellatrix knew, with a knowledge deeper than doctrine, that her life had already changed. Not because she would act, not because she would leave, or speak, or break any rule. Change had already occurred, as irrevocable as the shifting of a fault line. Love, she understood in that moment, was not an indulgence. It was a command. Not from a God who weighed and judged, but from a God who illuminated, who insisted that beauty and desire were not excesses to be trimmed away, but truths to be honored. She saw suddenly in good light the shape of her own restraint as something imposed, not chosen. She had believed it virtuous to dim herself, to cool her fire so that the structure around her would not crack. Now, she wondered whether structures that could not withstand warmth deserved did not frighten her at all. It clarified her, which was far more dangerous. The red tiefling smiled then, not broadly, not carelessly, but with the quiet assurance of someone who knew he was welcome in his own skin. He did not speak. He did not approach her. He did not need to. The recognition was mutual and complete without words, which saved everyone a great deal of explanation. Around them, the Aerie continued as it always had. Winds howled, wards held. Stone endured. The Dragonborn resumed their duties, and the bard's laughter softened as they settled into rest. Nothing outward had shifted. No alarm sounded, and yet no judgment Bellatrix stood at the threshold of something that could not be unlearned. She understood with a calm that surprised her that she would love this man, not briefly, not safely. She would love him in a way that burned and illuminated, that demanded a goddess and risk and change, or perhaps had been waiting all along. And the answer was not permission, but inevitability. Bellatrix did not yet know how she would leave the Aerie, or whether she could. She did not know what judgment might follow, or what balance might be broken by her choosing warmth over restraint. She knew only that the fire she carried was not meant to be contained forever, and that love had given it a direction. The mountain did not move, the system did not shatter, but something essential had shifted, and it would continue to shift patiently and irresistibly, until the measure by which the world was weighed would itself be forced to account for a truth it had never learned to record. In a place built to endure unchanged, Bellatrix Vesper stood newly aware that inevitability did not belong had its own gravity, and once felt, it did not ask whether the world was ready.